The October sun painted the fields of Encantado Ranch in golden hues as George Strait slowly walked down the hallway leading to his private study. At 71, the King of Country still carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined his career. But today, something weighed heavily on his heart. The ranch, sprawling across 2,000 acres of Texas hill country, had been his sanctuary for decades. But lately, it felt more like a museum of memories he wasn't sure he wanted to preserve. Martha Richardson, his longtime housekeeper and the closest thing to family he had left, knocked gently on the oak door before entering. She carried a steaming cup of black coffee, just the way he'd been drinking it since his rodeo days. "Mr. Strait, that reporter from the Austin Chronicle is here for the interview," Martha said, her weathered hands steady despite her 73 years. She'd worked for the Strait family for over 30 years, witnessing both the triumphs and the heartaches that fame couldn't heal. George looked up from the leather-bound album he'd been flipping through, filled with photographs from his early touring days. In many of the pictures, he wore different hats. His signature cowboy hats that had become as much a part of his identity as his voice. Each hat told a story, marked a milestone, represented a chapter of his life. "Thanks, Martha. Send him in," George said, closing the album and setting it aside. "And Martha, after this interview, I want you to call Rebecca Williams at the Children's Hospital Foundation. Tell her I've made a decision about the donation." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. For months, Rebecca had been trying to convince George to donate something significant for their annual charity auction. The foundation raised money for pediatric cancer treatment, a cause close to George's heart since losing a young fan named Tommy Mitchell to leukemia 15 years ago. "What are you thinking of donating, sir?" Martha asked carefully. George stood and walked to the massive oak cabinet that dominated one wall of his study. Behind the glass doors sat 37 cowboy hats, each meticulously maintained and displayed. They represented nearly 5 decades of his career, from the worn black resistol he'd bought with his first recording advance to the pristine white Stetson he'd worn at his final concert at the Alamodome. "All of them," George said quietly, his fingers tracing the glass. "The whole collection." Martha's coffee cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "Mr. Strait, are you sure? These hats, they're your history, your legacy." George turned back to her, and for a moment, Martha saw not the country music legend, but the grieving father who had lost his daughter Jennifer in a car accident 28 years ago. The man who had watched his son grow distant and resentful. The husband who still set 2 plates at dinner even though Norma had been gone for 3 years. "Maybe it's time someone else made some history with them," George said. "These hats have been sitting in this cabinet for too long. Tommy Mitchell would have been 30 this year, Martha. He never got to chase his dreams, never got to wear his own hat and make his mark. Maybe these can help other kids get that chance." The reporter, David Peterson from the Austin Chronicle, was a man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been covering Texas music for over 2 decades and had interviewed George several times, but never at the ranch. This was a privilege reserved for very few. "Mr. Strait, thank you for agreeing to this interview," David said, settling into the leather chair across from George's desk. "Your fans are curious about what you've been up to since retiring from touring. The ranch life seems to suit you." George smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, David, retirement's been good to me. I've got my cattle, my horses, and plenty of time to think. Maybe too much time, if I'm honest. You've been largely out of the public eye for the past few years. Any particular reason?" George was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to a framed photograph on his desk. It showed him, Norma, Jennifer, and his son Bubba at a family barbecue, all four of them laughing at something now forgotten. Bubba couldn't have been more than 20 in the photo, his arm around his father's shoulders, both wearing matching black cowboy hats. Sometimes a man needs to step back and evaluate what's really important, George finally said. I spent 40 years on the road, making music, building a career. But careers end, David. What matters is what you leave behind. And I'm not talking about songs or awards. David leaned forward, sensing there was more to this story. Speaking of leaving something behind, I heard a rumor that you're planning a significant donation to charity. Can you tell me about that? George's expression softened, and for the first time in the interview, his smile seemed genuine. I'm donating my hat collection to the Children's Hospital Foundation auction next month. 37 hats, each one from a different period of my career. David's pen stopped moving. This was bigger news than he'd expected. George Strait's hats were legendary among country music fans. They were worth a fortune individually, but as a complete collection, they were priceless. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Strait. What motivated this decision? George stood and walked to the window overlooking the ranch's main pasture, where a dozen quarter horses grazed in the afternoon sun. I met a little boy named Tommy Mitchell once, backstage in Houston. He was 8 years old, bald from chemo, wearing a cowboy hat that was too big for his head. He told me he wanted to be a country singer when he grew up, wanted to wear hats like mine and sing for people. Tommy didn't make it to his 9th birthday. The silence in the room was heavy with emotion. David didn't interrupt, sensing that George needed to tell this story. These hats have been sitting in a cabinet for years, George continued. They're beautiful. They're valuable. They're part of music history. But they're not doing anybody any good locked up in my house. Maybe the money from selling them can help some other kids like Tommy get the treatment they need. Maybe some of them will grow up to chase their dreams, wear their own hats, make their own music. David finished writing and looked up at George. This collection must be worth millions. Have you thought about what might happen to it after the auction? Will you be sad to see it broken up? George returned to his chair, and for a moment, he looked every one of his 71 years. The hardest part of getting older, David, is watching things you love slip away. My wife, my daughter, my touring days, He paused, seeming to catch himself before saying something he might regret. These hats represent a time in my life that's over. Maybe it's time they became part of someone else's story. After David left, George sat alone in his study as the sun began to set. Martha had prepared his dinner, but he wasn't hungry. Instead, he opened the cabinet and carefully removed the first hat. A brown resistal from 1981, the year Unwound hit #1. He held it in his hands, remembering the weight of it on his head during that first taste of real success. Each hat told a story. The white Stetson from his wedding to Norma in 1971. The black resistol he'd worn during his first appearance on the Grand Ole Opry. The silver-trimmed hat from his induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The simple brown hat he'd worn during his last conversation with his son 12 years ago in this very room. George had always been a man of few words, but that day 12 years ago, he'd said too many of the wrong ones. Bubba had wanted to pursue a different kind of music, something contemporary, something that would drag country music into the 21st century, as he'd put it. George had called it noise, had questioned his son's respect for tradition, for the music that had built their family's legacy. "You don't understand what real country music is," George had said, his voice cold with disappointment. "You want to chase trends instead of honoring what came before. And you want to live in the past," Bubba had shot back, his own voice rising. "Just because something's traditional doesn't mean it's better, Dad. Music evolves. Artists evolve. Why can't you? The argument had escalated from there, 12 years of accumulated frustrations spilling out in harsh words that neither man had been able to take back. Bubba had left that night, and they hadn't spoken since. George had learned from Martha that his son had moved to Nashville, then later to Los Angeles, pursuing his own music career under a different name. He'd achieved some success, Martha reported, though she was careful never to give too many details. George set the brown resistor back in its place and closed the cabinet. Tomorrow, Rebecca Williams would come to assess the collection and arrange for its transport to the auction house. After that, these hats would belong to the world, and he would finally have to learn to live with just his memories. His cell phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Mr. Strait, I can't thank you enough for this donation. The preliminary estimates suggest the collection could raise over $2 million for the foundation. You're going to help save so many children's lives." George typed back, "It's the right thing to do, Rebecca. These hats have been collecting dust. Time for them to do some good." But as he hit send, he found himself wondering if he was really ready to let go of the last tangible connections to the life he'd built, the man he'd been, and the family he'd lost. Rebecca Williams arrived at Encantado Ranch early the next morning, accompanied by James Morrison, the premier appraiser for Heritage Western Auctions in Dallas. Rebecca had been running the Children's Hospital Foundation for 8 years, and in that time, she'd received many generous donations, but nothing quite like this. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of warm smile that immediately put people at ease, a necessary skill when asking wealthy Texans to part with their money for charity. James Morrison was tall and thin, with careful hands and an eye for detail that had made him the most sought-after appraiser of Western memorabilia in the country. He'd authenticated everything from Wild Bill Hickok's gun belt to Roy Rogers' saddle, but even he seemed nervous about handling George Strait's personal collection. Martha led them into the study where George was waiting. He'd risen early and spent the morning walking the ranch, trying to reconcile himself to what he was about to do. "George, I can't tell you how grateful we are," Rebecca said, extending her hand. "When I got Martha's call yesterday, I could barely believe it." "Well, Rebecca, you've been after me for a donation for 2 years now," George replied with a slight smile. "I figured I better give you something worth your persistence." James approached the cabinet with something approaching reverence. "Mr. Strait, I've been appraising Western memorabilia for 25 years, and I've never seen a collection quite like this. The historical significance alone, but the fact that these are all from your personal collection, worn during specific performances and recordings, that elevates their value exponentially." George unlocked the cabinet and stepped back. "Well, James, what do you think they're worth?" James began examining each hat carefully, taking photographs and making notes in a leather-bound journal. He handled each piece with white cotton gloves, turning them carefully to examine the sweatbands, looking for maker's marks, assessing the condition of the felt and the age of the leather. "This brown resistol," James said, holding the first hat George had touched the night before. "Based on the style and the maker's mark, I'd estimate this is from the early 1980s. The condition is excellent, barely any wear on the brim. If this was worn during significant performances or recordings, that's the hat I wore when Unwound hit #1, George said quietly. "Wore it to my first CMA Awards ceremony that year, too." James made a note and carefully returned the hat to its place. "Conservatively, at auction, I'd estimate this piece alone could bring between $50,000 and $75,000. Rebecca's eyes widened. Even she hadn't expected individual pieces to be worth quite that much. The appraisal continued for over 2 hours. The white Stetson from George's wedding, personal provenance like this is incredibly rare, James noted. The black resistal from his Grand Ole Opry debut. Early Opry memorabilia is extremely desirable among collectors. The silver-trimmed hat from his Hall of Fame induction. Awards show pieces always perform well at auction. But it was the 37th hat, a simple black resistol that looked almost identical to several others in the collection, that caught James's attention for the longest time. "This one's interesting," James said, examining the hat more closely. "The wear pattern is different from the others. This was worn regularly, not just for special occasions, but the style suggests it's from much later in your career." George's expression grew distant. "That's the hat I wore during my last recording session. The Breath You Take, in 2009. My son was supposed to be there that day, but..." He trailed off, not finishing the sentence. James sensed the emotional weight behind the piece and handled it even more carefully. Personal family significance always adds to a piece's value, though that's harder to quantify. When the appraisal was complete, James closed his journal and looked at George with something approaching awe. "Mr. Strait, as a complete collection, I estimate this could bring anywhere from $2 to $3 million at auction. Possibly more if you get the right bidders in the room." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. $3 million would fund the foundation's operations for 3 years, would pay for hundreds of children's treatments, would literally save lives. "There's one thing we should discuss," James continued. "A collection like this will attract international attention. We'll have bidders from all over the world, private collectors, museums, even foreign governments who want to acquire pieces of American cultural history. Are you prepared for the possibility that these hats might end up scattered across the globe?" George nodded slowly. "I've thought about that. These hats belonged to me for decades, but they were never really just mine. They belonged to country music, to the fans, to the tradition. Maybe it's time they belong to the world." Rebecca squeezed George's hand. "We'll make sure every bidder knows exactly what their purchase is supporting. This isn't just an auction. It's a chance to be part of saving children's lives." After Rebecca and James left to begin preparations for the auction, George found himself alone in his study once again. The cabinet looked somehow empty, even though all the hats were still there. Maybe it was just the knowledge that their time in this room was coming to an end. Martha knocked and entered with a fresh cup of coffee. "You doing okay, sir? This has to be difficult." George accepted the coffee and settled into his chair. "Martha, can I ask you something? Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" Martha had known George long enough to recognize when he needed honesty rather than reassurance. "I think you're doing a generous thing, Mr. Strait, but I also think there might be more to this than just charity." George looked at her questioningly. "These hats," Martha continued, "they're not just about your career. They're about your family, too. That white one from your wedding, the black one from when Bubba was born, the silver one from Jennifer's high school graduation. You're giving away more than just memorabilia." George was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe that's exactly what I need to do, Martha. Maybe I've been holding on to these things too tightly, using them as an excuse not to move forward. Or maybe," Martha said gently, "you're hoping that letting them go will somehow bring back what you've lost." That evening, George made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in 12 years. His finger hovered over Bubba's name for a full minute before he set the phone down. Instead, he opened his laptop, a concession to modern technology that Martha had insisted upon, and began typing an email to Rebecca Williams. "Rebecca," he wrote, "I want to add one condition to the donation. I want the auction house to keep the identity of all winning bidders confidential until after the auction is complete. I don't want anyone bidding just because they know it will please me. and I don't want to know where the hats end up until it's all over. Can you arrange that?" Rebecca's response came within an hour. "Of course, George. Heritage auctions can absolutely arrange for anonymous bidding. Is there any particular reason for this request?" George stared at the screen for a long time before typing his reply. "Sometimes it's easier to let go when you don't have to watch where things land." 2 weeks later, the announcement appeared in newspapers and music industry publications around the world. King of Country George Strait donates legendary hat collection to charity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Heritage Western Auctions received inquiries from collectors in Japan, museum curators in Germany, and private buyers from across the United States. But in a small recording studio in Los Angeles, a man named George Harvey Strait Jr., who had been performing under the name Harvey George for the past decade, read the news with a mixture of surprise, sadness, and something that might have been hope. Bubba Strait had built a successful career as a songwriter and producer, working with artists who blended traditional country with contemporary sounds. It was the kind of music he'd tried to share with his father 12 years ago, the kind of music that had driven the wedge between them. He'd won a Grammy for producing an album that Rolling Stone called the perfect bridge between country's past and future. But his father had never acknowledged the achievement. Now, reading about the hat auction, Bubba found himself remembering the brown resistol his father had worn during their last argument, the one that had sat on the desk between them like a symbol of everything they couldn't agree on. For 12 years, Bubba had told himself he didn't care about his father's approval, didn't need the old man's blessing to validate his career. But seeing news of the hat donation, knowing that George was literally giving away pieces of their shared history, brought back all the pain and longing he'd tried to bury. That night, Bubba called Heritage Western Auctions and registered as an anonymous bidder for the upcoming auction. He didn't have a plan, didn't know what he'd do if he actually won anything. He just knew he couldn't bear the thought of his family's history being scattered to strangers without even trying to save some piece of it. The Heritage Western Auctions House in Dallas was buzzing with activity on the morning of November 15th. The George Strait hat collection had drawn bidders from across the globe, and the pre-auction viewing had been packed for 3 days straight. Collectors, museum curators, and country music fans had traveled from as far away as Tokyo and London to see the legendary collection in person. Patricia Henderson, Heritage's lead auction coordinator, had worked dozens of high-profile auctions, but even she was impressed by the attention this event had generated. "We've got over 300 registered bidders," she told her assistant, Michael Torres, as they made final preparations. 43 of them are bidding anonymously through phone representatives. George had chosen not to attend the auction in person. Instead, he was spending the day at the ranch with Martha, trying to keep busy with routine chores while his life's collection was dispersed to the highest bidders. Rebecca Williams had promised to call him with updates throughout the day. In Los Angeles, Bubba sat in his home studio, a converted garage behind the modest house he'd bought in Laurel Canyon. He'd arranged to bid by phone through a representative at the auction house, giving him anonymity while allowing him to participate. His wife, Sarah Mitchell Strait, sat beside him. She was a talented singer-songwriter in her own right, and one of the few people who knew about Bubba's estrangement from his famous father. Sarah was a petite woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes who had grown up in Nashville as the daughter of session musicians. She'd met Bubba 5 years earlier when he was producing an album for her former band. They'd married 3 years ago in a small ceremony that George hadn't attended. Not because he wasn't invited, but because Bubba had never sent an invitation. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said, squeezing Bubba's hand. "You could just call him. After all these years, maybe he'd want to hear from you." Bubba shook his head. "You don't understand. My father isn't the kind of man who changes his mind. When he decided I wasn't the son he wanted, that was it. This auction, it proves it. He's literally giving away everything that connects us. The auction began at 10 a.m. with smaller items, belt buckles, boots, and photographs, before building to the main event, the 37 hats. The bidding was fierce from the start. A pair of custom-made boots sold for $12,000. A signed photograph from George's first CMA Awards ceremony brought $15,000. But it was when Patricia Henderson brought out the first hat, the brown Resistal from 1981, that the real excitement began. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia announced, "we begin the hat collection with lot number 47. This is the brown Resistal worn by Mr. Strait during his first #1 hit, Unwound, and his first CMA Awards ceremony appearance. Bidding starts at $25,000. The bidding shot up immediately. A collector from Nashville bid $30,000. A museum in Austin countered with $40,000. A private collector from Japan, bidding by phone, pushed it to $55,000. And then bidder number 127, represented by phone, entered the fray. $60,000, came the calm voice of the phone representative. The Japanese collector went to $65,000. Bidder 127 immediately responded with $70,000. When the Japanese collector dropped out and no other bidders entered, the first hat sold to the anonymous bidder 127 for $70,000. In Los Angeles, Bubba felt his heart racing. He'd just spent more than he'd ever spent on anything except his house. But holding that first victory felt like reclaiming a small piece of his childhood. The second hat, the white Stetson from George and Norma's wedding, proved even more valuable. The bidding started at $30,000 and quickly climbed to $80,000 between a collector from Germany and a country music museum in Tennessee. Once again, bidder 127 entered at the last moment. $90,000, his representative announced. The museum dropped out immediately. The German collector pushed to $100,000. Bidder 127 countered with $110,000. And when no other bids came, the wedding hat was his. Sarah watched her husband with growing concern. "Bubba, that's almost $200,000 on just 2 hats. We don't have unlimited money." "I know," Bubba replied, his voice tight with emotion. "But I can't let strangers have these hats. They're my family history, too. That white one was on my father's head when he married my mother. I was there when he wore the brown one to awards shows. These aren't just collectibles to me." At Encantado Ranch, George received regular updates from Rebecca Williams. "George, the bidding is incredible," she told him during their third phone call of the day. "We've sold 12 hats so far, and we've already raised over $1 million. There's something interesting happening, though. We have one anonymous bidder who's been winning almost everything. Bidder number 127. They've purchased 9 of the 12 hats sold so far." George felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that the hats weren't being scattered to dozens of different collectors around the world. Disappointment that he had no idea who was acquiring such a significant piece of his life. "Any idea who it might be?" George asked. "None," Rebecca replied. "They're bidding through a phone representative and have requested complete anonymity. But George, they're spending serious money. Each hat has gone for well above our estimates." The auction continued through the afternoon. Hat after hat went to bidder 127, despite increasingly aggressive competition from other collectors. The black Resistol from George's Grand Ole Opry debut sold for $125,000. The hat from his final concert at the Alamo Dome brought $140,000. By late afternoon, Bubba had won 28 of the 37 hats, spending over $2 million in the process. He'd had to call his business manager twice to arrange additional funding, liquidating investment accounts, and taking out a loan against his house. Sarah had long since stopped questioning his decisions, recognizing that this was about something much deeper than money. But it was the 37th hat that proved the most emotional moment of the day. When Patricia Henderson brought out the simple black resistal from George's final recording session, her voice caught slightly as she read the description. "This is lot number 83, the final hat in the George Strait collection. This black resistal was worn by Mr. Strait during his final recording session in 2009. According to the consignment notes, this hat has particular personal significance to Mr. Strait. The bidding started at $50,000, but quickly escalated. A collector from England pushed it to $100,000. A museum in Nashville countered with $125,000. A private collector from Texas, one of the few bidders whose identity was known, entered with $150,000. Bidder 127 had been quiet for several lots, and other bidders seemed to sense this might be their chance to finally outbid the mysterious collector who had dominated the auction. The price climbed to $200,000, then $225,000. At $250,000, only two bidders remained: the private collector from Texas and bidder 127. In Los Angeles, Bubba stared at the phone in his hand. This was the hat his father had worn during their last conversation, the one that had sat on the desk between them like a barrier neither could cross. He thought about that day 12 years ago, about the harsh words, about the pride that had kept both men from reaching out since then. $260,000, Bubba said quietly to his phone representative. The Texan collector countered with $275,000. $300,000, Bubba said, his voice stronger now. Silence filled the auction room. $300,000 was an extraordinary price for a single hat, even one with such provenance. "Do I hear 310,000? Patricia asked. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. Going once at $300,000 to bidder 127. Going twice, sold to bidder 127 for $300,000. The auction room erupted in applause. In one day, the George Strait hat collection had raised over $3 million for the Children's Hospital Foundation, with the vast majority of the items going to a single anonymous bidder. But as the auction house began processing the sales and arranging payment, Patricia Henderson received an unusual request from bidder 127. Instead of arranging to have the hats shipped to his address, the mysterious buyer wanted to pick them up in person in 1 week's time. "That's highly unusual," Patricia told her assistant. "Anonymous bidders almost always want their purchases shipped discreetly. But this buyer specifically requested a face-to-face transfer." At Encantado Ranch, George received Rebecca's final call of the day with mixed emotions. The auction had been a tremendous success for the foundation, but the knowledge that nearly his entire collection had gone to one person left him feeling strangely unsettled. "I wish I knew who bought them," George admitted to Martha over dinner. "Not knowing. It's like sending your children off to live with strangers." Martha, who had been unusually quiet all day, finally spoke up. "Mr. Strait, what if they're not going to a stranger? What if someone who understands what these hats really mean decided they needed to stay together?" George looked at her sharply. "Martha, do you know something I don't?" Martha shook her head. "No, sir. I'm just saying that sometimes the universe has a way of putting things where they belong. Maybe these hats aren't leaving your life. Maybe they're just taking a different path back to where they're supposed to be." That night, George lay awake thinking about Martha's words. For the first time in years, he found himself hoping, not just that the hats had gone to someone who would appreciate them, but that somehow, in some way, The decision to let them go might open a door that had been closed for far too long. In Los Angeles, Bubba was making arrangements to fly to Dallas to collect his purchase. He'd bought back his father's history, but he still didn't know what he was going to do with it. All he knew was that on November 22nd, exactly 1 week after the auction, he would walk into Heritage Western Auctions and claim the collection that represented both his inheritance and the divide that had separated him from his father for over a decade. The question that kept him awake was whether he had the courage to take the hats home to Texas, to the ranch where they belonged, and to the conversation he and his father should have had 12 years ago. November 22nd dawned gray and cold in Dallas, with the kind of overcast sky that made the whole world feel muted and uncertain. At Heritage Western Auctions, Patricia Henderson arrived early to oversee the transfer of the George Strait collection to its mysterious new owner. She had worked in the auction business for 15 years, but she'd never had a sale quite like this one. The hats had been carefully cleaned, conditioned, and placed in custom archival boxes. Each box was labeled with the hat's lot number and a brief description of its significance. Together, they represented not just $3 million in sales, but nearly 50 years of American music history. At 10 a.m. sharp, Patricia received a call from the front desk. "Ms. Henderson, we have someone here for the Strait collection pickup. Should we send them up?" "Yes, please," Patricia replied, smoothing her jacket. She was curious to finally meet the person who had spent a fortune to keep George Strait's legacy intact. When the elevator doors opened, Patricia found herself face to face with a man in his 50s, wearing jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and familiar blue eyes. There was something about his face that seemed familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen him before. "Ms. Henderson, I'm here for the Strait collection. Bidder 127. Patricia extended her hand. "Of course. I have to say, Mr. "George," the man replied. "George Harvey." Patricia led him to the secure storage room where the collection waited. "Mr. Harvey, I have to tell you, in all my years doing this, I've never seen anyone acquire a complete collection like this. These hats, they tell the entire story of George Strait's career. You must be quite a fan." George Harvey. Bubba stood quietly looking at the 37 boxes stacked neatly on the table. Each one contained a piece of his childhood, a fragment of the relationship he'd lost with his father. "You could say that," he replied softly. As Patricia began the paperwork, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. "If you don't mind me asking, what are your plans for the collection? Are you a private collector? A museum?" Bubba was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the box containing the brown resistal from 1981. "I'm taking them home," he finally said. "They've been away from home long enough." After completing the purchase and loading the boxes into a rented truck, Bubba found himself sitting in the Heritage Auctions parking lot, staring at his phone. He had his father's address programmed into his GPS. It was a 3-hour drive from Dallas to the ranch. But he also had his father's phone number, still listed in his contacts after all these years. His finger hovered over the call button for several minutes before he finally made his decision. Instead of calling, he started the truck and began driving toward Encantado Ranch. Some conversations, he realized, couldn't happen over the phone. Meanwhile, at the ranch, George was spending the morning in his empty study. The cabinet that had held his hat collection for decades now stood open and bare. He'd asked Martha to leave it that way, not ready to fill it with something else, not ready to pretend that the empty space didn't matter. Rebecca Williams had called that morning to thank him again and to let him know that the foundation had already begun using the auction proceeds to fund treatment for children who couldn't otherwise afford it. It was gratifying news, but it didn't fill the strange, hollow feeling that had settled in George's chest since the auction. Martha knocked and entered with lunch on a tray. "You need to eat something, Mr. Strait. You've been sitting in here all morning." George accepted the sandwich but didn't take a bite. "Martha, do you ever wonder what happens to the things we let go of? Whether they find their way to where they're supposed to be?" Before Martha could answer, her cell phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's the security gate." "Excuse me, sir." She answered the call and listened for a moment. "Mr. Strait, there's someone at the gate asking to see you. Says his name is George Harvey, and that he has something that belongs to you." George's heart skipped a beat, though he couldn't say why. Did he say what it was? Martha spoke into the phone again, then looked at George with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sir, he says he has your hats. All of them." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. George felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the implications of Martha's words sank in. Someone had bought his entire collection and driven it back to the ranch. But who? And why? "Tell security to let him through," George said, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha gave the instruction and hung up the phone. "Mr. Strait, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." George stood and walked to the window that overlooked the main drive. In the distance, he could see a white rental truck making its way up the long gravel road that led to the house. Behind it, a dust cloud rose in the still air, marking its progress like a signal flare. "Maybe I have, Martha. Maybe I have." As the truck drew closer, George could make out the silhouette of the driver through the windshield. There was something familiar about the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head. George's breath caught in his throat as a possibility too incredible to believe began to form in his mind. The truck pulled to a stop in front of the house, and the driver sat motionless for a long moment before the door opened. When the man stepped out, George's knees nearly buckled. It was Bubba, his son. The boy who had left this ranch 12 years ago as a young man full of anger and pride was now in his 40s, his dark hair streaked with gray, his face bearing the lines that come with time and experience. But the eyes were the same. George's own blue eyes, inherited through generations of straight men. "Oh my God," Martha whispered, having joined George at the window. "Mr. Strait, it's Bubba." George couldn't speak. He watched as his son walked to the back of the truck and lowered the tailgate, revealing dozens of carefully packed boxes. Bubba lifted one of the boxes and held it for a moment, as if weighing more than just its physical contents. Then Bubba looked up at the house, his gaze finding the study window where his father stood. Across the distance of the yard and the years, father and son looked at each other for the first time in over a decade. Martha gently touched George's arm. "Go to him, sir. Whatever happened between you two, it's been long enough." George nodded, unable to trust his voice. He walked slowly through the house, each step feeling like it carried the weight of 12 years of silence, 12 years of pride, 12 years of missing his son. When he reached the front door, he paused with his hand on the handle, suddenly afraid that this was all a dream, that he would open the door to an empty driveway. But when he stepped outside, Bubba was still there, still real, still holding a box that contained a piece of their shared history. "Hello, Dad," Bubba said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of emotion that matched his father's. "Son," George replied, the word coming out rougher than he'd intended. I didn't know it was you." At the auction, Bubba set the box down on the tailgate and faced his father fully. "I couldn't let strangers have them. They're not just your hats, Dad. They're our family's history. My history, too." The two men stood 20 feet apart, a distance that felt both infinite and insignificant. George could see so much of Norma in Bubba's face, could see the boy who used to follow him around the ranch, begging to help with the horses, asking endless questions about music and life and everything in between. "You spent $3 million, George said, still trying to process what had happened. "I spent what they were worth to me," Bubba replied. "Though I have to admit, I maxed out pretty much everything I had to do it." Despite the emotional weight of the moment, George almost smiled. "Your mother always said you had more heart than sense when it came to money. I learned that from watching you give everything away to charity." Bubba shot back, but there was no venom in it, just the gentle teasing that had once been natural between them. The silence stretched between them, filled with 12 years of words unspoken, apologies not given, pride that had kept two stubborn men apart when they should have been together. Finally, George took a step forward. "Why did you bring them back?" Bubba looked down at his boots, then back up at his father. "Because they belong here. Because—" He paused, struggling with words that had been building up for over a decade. "Because I never stopped hoping that someday we'd figure out how to be father and son again." George felt tears he hadn't cried in years threatening to spill over. "Bubba, that day, 12 years ago, the things I said, the things we both said," Bubba corrected. "I was just as stubborn, just as proud. I wanted you to accept my music, my choices, my life. But I never tried to understand why the traditional ways mattered so much to you." George took another step closer. "And I wanted you to honor the past without realizing that you had every right to build your own future. You were never supposed to be me, son. You were supposed to be you. I've done well for myself, Dad. I know you probably never looked me up, but I've had a good career. I won a Grammy 2 years ago for producing an album that, well, that probably would have made you proud. It honored the traditional while pushing into new territory." George's eyes widened. "Harvey George, I did look you up, son. Martha made sure I knew. I bought that album. I've bought everything you've worked on. I didn't know how to reach out, how to tell you I was proud without it seeming like too little, too late." Now it was Bubba's turn to be surprised. You've been following my career? Every step of it, every award, every success. I wanted to call you after the Grammy win, but I didn't think you'd want to hear from me." The distance between them had shrunk to just a few feet. Both men were crying now, 12 years of pain and love and missed opportunities flowing out in tears they'd been too proud to shed. "I named my production company Encantado Records," Bubba said quietly. "After the ranch, after home. My business partners never understood why, but I couldn't bring myself to completely let go of this place." George reached out tentatively, and when Bubba didn't pull away, he placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "You never had to let go, son. This place, this family, it's always been yours, too." They stood like that for a moment, father and son, the physical contact bridging years of separation. Then Bubba gestured toward the boxes in the truck. "What do you want me to do with these? They're legally mine now, but—" George looked at the truck, then back at his son. "They were always meant to be yours anyway, someday. Maybe not all at once like this, but eventually. The only difference is now you chose them instead of just inheriting them. I was thinking," Bubba said carefully, "maybe we could put them back in the cabinet, together. And maybe I could stick around for a while, help you decide what stories go with each one. There are probably some I never heard." George's smile was the first genuine one he'd worn in months. "I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much." As they began carrying the boxes into the house, Martha appeared on the front porch, tears streaming down her face. She'd watched this family for 30 years, had seen it built and broken, and now, miraculously, beginning to heal. "Martha," George called to her. You better set an extra place for dinner. And call Rebecca Williams. Tell her that the mysterious bidder turned out to be someone who understands exactly what those hats are worth." As they worked together to carry the collection back into the house, father and son began the tentative process of rebuilding what had been broken. There would be more conversations, more revelations, more healing to be done. But for now, it was enough that the hats had come home, and that they had brought Bubba home with them. The late afternoon sun streamed through the study windows as George and Bubba carefully unpacked each hat and returned it to its place in the cabinet. It was slow, methodical work, not because the task was difficult, but because each hat prompted a story, a memory, a piece of history that had been locked away for too long. "This white Stetson," George said, holding the hat he'd worn to marry Norma. "Your mother picked this out. Said a man couldn't get married in just any old hat, that it had to be something special." Bubba smiled, running his fingers along the pristine brim. "I remember this hat. You wore it to church on Sundays when I was little. Mom always said you looked like a movie star in it." "She was biased," George replied, but his voice was warm with the memory. "Your mother thought I looked good in everything. Even when I came in from working cattle covered in dust and manure." They continued unpacking, each hat bringing with it a flood of memories. The black resistal from George's Opry debut prompted stories about the early days of his career. The nervousness he'd felt stepping onto that sacred stage. The way Norma had waited in the wings, more nervous than he was. "I wish I'd been there," Bubba said quietly. "For more of those moments." George paused in his unpacking. "You were there for the ones that mattered most, son. The first time I wore this brown one." He held up the resistal from Unwound. "You were 3 years old. You toddled up to me before I left for the studio and said, 'Daddy looked like cowboy.' That meant more to me than any review in any magazine." As the afternoon wore on, Martha busied herself in the kitchen, preparing what she already knew would be the most important dinner she'd cooked in years. She could hear the voices from the study, the laughter that punctuated the conversation, the healing that was happening one story at a time. Sarah called around 4 o'clock, having driven most of the day from Los Angeles after Bubba called to tell her where he'd gone. "How did it go?" she asked when Bubba answered his phone. "Good," Bubba said, stepping out onto the front porch for privacy. "Really good. We're talking. Really talking. And your dad? How's he handling all this?" Bubba looked back through the window at his father, who was carefully adjusting the placement of a silver-trimmed hat in the cabinet. "I think he's been waiting for this as long as I have. Maybe longer." "I'm about an hour out from the ranch," Sarah said. "Are you sure it's okay for me to come? This is your family time." "You're my family too," Bubba replied. "And I want Dad to meet you properly. I want him to know the woman who convinced me it was okay to love someone completely, even when I thought I wasn't worth loving." When Sarah arrived, George was waiting on the front porch with Bubba. She was smaller than he'd expected, with kind eyes and a warm smile that reminded him instantly of Norma. When she stepped out of her car, George could see immediately why his son had fallen in love with her. "Mr. Strait," Sarah said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah. I've heard so much about you over the years." George took her hand in both of his. "Please, call me George. And I'm sorry I haven't met you before now. That's my fault, not Bubba's." "Actually," Sarah said with a gentle smile, "it's both your faults. But stubborn runs in the family, I'm told." George laughed, the first real laugh he'd had in months. "I like her already," he said to Bubba. Over dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than any of them had expected. Sarah told stories about Bubba's work in Los Angeles, about the artists he'd helped, about the music he'd created that honored his roots while pushing boundaries. George shared memories of Bubba's childhood, Stories Sarah had never heard about the boy who'd grown up on this ranch dreaming of making music. "He used to follow me around with a toy guitar," George told Sarah, "singing at the top of his lungs. Couldn't carry a tune in a bucket back then, but he had the passion. That's something you can't teach." "He still can't carry a tune," Sarah said with a grin. Good thing he discovered he had a gift for production instead of performance. "Hey," Bubba protested, but he was smiling. "I can carry a tune just fine. I just choose not to inflict it on innocent bystanders." As the evening wound down, George found himself reluctant to see it end. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again, filled with laughter and conversation, and the kind of easy familiarity that had been missing since Norma's death. "Where are you two staying tonight?" George asked, as Martha began clearing the dinner dishes. Bubba and Sarah exchanged glances. "We hadn't really thought about it," Bubba admitted. "Maybe a hotel in town?" "Nonsense," George said firmly. "Your room is still exactly the way you left it, son. Sarah can take the guest room, or—" He paused, suddenly aware that he might be making assumptions about their relationship. "We're married, Dad," Bubba said gently. 3 years now. I know I should have told you, should have invited you, but—" George felt a familiar pang of regret for all the moments he'd missed, all the celebrations he hadn't been part of. But instead of dwelling on it, he forced himself to focus on the future. "Well then, you'll take your old room together. I'll have Martha make sure it's ready." Later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed, George and Bubba found themselves back in the study, sitting in comfortable chairs beside the now full cabinet. The hats looked right there, George realized. They belonged in this room, in this house, as part of this family's history. "I have something for you," George said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a legal document that had been prepared months earlier but never signed. "I've been meaning to update my will. This ranch, the music publishing, all of it. It's yours anyway. But I wanted to make it official." Bubba took the papers but didn't look at them. "Dad, I don't want your money or your property. I just want my father back." "You've got him, son. You've had him all along, even when he was too proud to show it." George leaned forward in his chair. "But this ranch, this land, it's been in our family for 4 generations. It should stay that way. And maybe someday, if you and Sarah are blessed with children." "We're trying," Bubba said quietly. "Sarah's pregnant. Early yet, but we're hoping." George felt his heart swell with an emotion he thought he'd forgotten how to feel. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "A grandchild," he whispered. "Lord, Norma would have been over the moon. We were going to wait until we were further along to tell anyone, but I guess I wanted you to know. Wanted you to know that this family isn't ending with me." George stood up and walked to the cabinet, running his hand along the glass that protected his life's work. "You know, son, I spent so many years thinking about legacy, about what I'd leave behind. These hats, the music, the career, I thought that was what mattered. But sitting here tonight, talking with you and Sarah, thinking about a grandchild I haven't even met yet, that's the real legacy. Family, love, the things that last longer than any song or any hat." Bubba joined his father at the cabinet. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "maybe I could move back to Texas, set up a satellite office for my production company here. Sarah's been wanting to get out of Los Angeles anyway. And if we're going to have a baby, this ranch is big enough for all of us," George said immediately. "Hell, it's big enough for a dozen families. We could build you a house on the south pasture, close enough to be family, far enough to have privacy. Or," Bubba said with a smile, "we could just live here. This house is big enough too, and it would be nice for a kid to grow up the way I did, with plenty of space to run and horses to ride. and a grandfather to spoil them rotten. George turned to look at his son, hardly believing what he was hearing. "You'd really move back? Give up your life in California?" "Dad, my life isn't in California. It never was. My life is wherever my family is, and my family is here." They talked until well past midnight, making plans, sharing dreams, rebuilding the relationship that had been broken by pride and misunderstanding. When they finally said goodnight, George felt lighter than he had in years, as if a weight he'd carried for so long had finally been lifted from his shoulders. 3 months later, on a crisp February morning, George stood on the front porch of the ranch house watching as a moving truck made its way up the long drive. Bubba and Sarah had sold their house in Los Angeles and were coming home to Texas, bringing with them not just their possessions, but their future. Sarah was now showing, her pregnancy progressing beautifully, and George had already begun converting one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery. Martha, despite being in her 70s, had thrown herself into the project with the enthusiasm of a woman half her age, delighting in the prospect of a baby in the house again. The hat collection had remained in the study cabinet, but now it served a different purpose. Instead of being a monument to the past, it had become a bridge to the future. George had begun writing down the story behind each hat, creating a record that he could someday share with his grandchild. A family history that would connect the baby to generations of Strait family tradition. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Sarah's obstetrician in Austin, had confirmed that the baby was healthy and due in early September. They'd chosen not to learn the baby's sex, wanting to be surprised. But George secretly hoped for a grandson he could teach to ride and rope, and maybe, if the boy was interested, play guitar. But more than anything, George was grateful for the chance to be present for this new chapter of his family's story. He'd missed too much already. Bubba's wedding, years of his son's career, countless moments that could never be recovered. But the future was still unwritten, still full of possibilities. That evening, as the three of them sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and purple, George felt a contentment he'd thought was lost forever. The ranch was alive again, filled with the voices and laughter of family. The hats in his study had served their purpose, bringing his son home not as a stranger, but as the man he'd grown into during their years apart. "Thank you," George said quietly, speaking to both Bubba and Sarah, but also to the universe, to whatever force had orchestrated the unlikely series of events that had brought them all together. "For what?" Bubba asked. George gestured toward the horizon, where the last light of day was fading into the deep blue of a Texas night. "For this, for second chances, for the wisdom to know that some things are worth more than money, more than pride, more than being right." Sarah reached over and squeezed George's hand. "Family is worth everything," she said simply, as if to emphasize the point. She placed George's hand on her growing belly, where his grandchild was already making its presence known, with gentle kicks and movements. In that moment, George understood that the greatest performance of his life wasn't any song he'd ever sung, any award he'd ever won, or any hat he'd ever worn. It was this: sitting on his front porch with his son and daughter-in-law, feeling his grandchild move beneath his palm, knowing that the Strait family legacy would continue, not because of what he'd accomplished, but because of the love that connected them all. The hats in his study cabinet would always be treasures, reminders of a remarkable career and a life well lived. But the real treasure was here, in this moment, in this family that had found its way back to wholeness. And in September, when George Strait held his granddaughter, or it would turn out to be a girl, with her mother's dark hair and her grandfather's blue eyes, for the first time, he would place his own black cowboy hat gently on her tiny head and whisper, "Welcome home, little one. Welcome home." The hat collection had come full circle, from symbols of success to bridges of reconciliation to promises of the future. And in the end, that was the most valuable thing George Strait had ever owned. Not the hats themselves, but the love and family they had helped him reclaim. 5 years later, George Strait III, nicknamed Georgie by her adoring grandfather, would toddle into his study wearing a miniature pink cowboy hat, her small hands reaching up toward the cabinet where 37 pieces of family history waited to tell their stories to a new generation. And George, now a grandfather whose greatest joy was reading bedtime stories about musical adventures and family love, would lift her up to see the hats that had traveled so far from home, only to find their way back where they belonged. The circle was complete, the legacy secure, and the music of the Strait family would play on for generations to come.